All right, so we have District 4, District 5, and District 6. In this panel, we have the moderators, which will be Sameth. Raise your hand, Sameth. We have Felicia and Lynn. Say hi, Lynn. And so just to recap real quick, the forum that we have, the candidates each have 1 minute to introduce themselves to the audience. Then the panelists will be asking 3 questions. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer the question. The timekeeper, it's Guy from the Phillips Randolph Institute. Say hi. And he will let you guys know, as you already know, when the buzzer's up, you guys please wrap up your answer. And there'll be 2 audience questions. So last round we had to make it really quick because of the audio issues. But this time we'll get 2 questions in. And so let's get started. So I'm going to pass it on to the moderators. But first, let's get to know who all the candidates are. So if you can get the microphone and just introduce yourself real quickly, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Maddox, and I'm running for Seattle City Council in District 4. I got into this race a year ago today, actually, because we're facing an affordability crisis in the city of Seattle, and I believe it's time for us to take some more bold and meaningful action to address that crisis, both as it extends to our residential areas as well as for our small businesses. I want to make sure that we are a city that's going to be welcoming new community members and doing so in a way that's going to have housing that is affordable and great walkable communities. I bring a lifetime of public service to this race. From my time working at Planned Parenthood, connecting high-risk and homeless youth to shelter and services, to my time at the bargaining table with Group Health, protecting worker pay and benefits. Over the last 5 years, I've been on the Parks Levy Oversight Committee, making sure that we're making investments in parks that are going to be clean, safe, and welcoming in our neighborhoods, as well as a member of the Parks Legacy Committee, ensuring that we have permanent, stable funding for our community centers across the city of Seattle. I'm looking forward to a fantastic opportunity to speak with you all today. Thank you all for coming out. Again, Michael Maddox, District 4.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Johnson. I'm the other candidate in District 4. For those who aren't familiar with the new boundaries of the district model, District 4 is everything south of 85th and east of I-5 in Northeast Seattle. It also has the Wallingford neighborhood and the Eastlake neighborhood. I'm a 5th generation Seattleite, and I got into this race because I think that we're at an incredible inflection point in our city's history. We need to be much more welcoming of working families being able to afford to live here in the city, and I'm proud of the work that I've done to help make Seattle a more affordable place. My day job is to fight for more public transit service here in Washington. I run a nonprofit called Transportation Choices Coalition, and we were responsible for the recent passage of the largest bus increase in the city's history, as well as the Orca Lift program, which provides a low-income fare for anybody who qualifies at, I believe it's 60% of area median income or lower. So for me, I think that we really need to focus on environmental issues, public transportation, and housing affordability. That's why I got in this race. Happy to be here today. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you guys for being here. My name is Deborah Juarez, and I'm running for District 5, and that is North Seattle from 85th to 145th. You can learn a lot about mine. I'm a lawyer member of the Black Creek Nation. I've been a lawyer for 28 years. But I want to say something. I came here early today because I wanted to watch the first panel, and I literally started to tear up because 2 women who I admire deeply and think so much of, Shama and Pamela, the women of color me and who are watching them and them being inspiring me. I just want us all to remember that we can't be divided. Because immigrants and slaves built this country, like my people. And the only way we got ahead and everything we have is we stand here, people of colors, because we fought for it and we did it together. So I'm hoping that you'll look at my election closely and you'll support me, and we'll be all supportive in this spirit of making Seattle better. Thank you.
Hey guys, my name is Lynn, and to all of your introductions, you talked about jobs, affordability, housing, all of that stuff. I think the silver lining is all of that stuff is access to living wage and living wage jobs that are in our community. One way to help community of colors and immigrants, refugees is to be able to be a part of that employment opportunities. So this is the first question. In the next 5 years, close to 40% of the employees in this will be retiring. How will you improve job training program, expand hiring opportunities, outreach, and support so that people of color, immigrants, and refugees can have access. That's my first question. Any of you can take that. Thank you.
You want any of us?
Yes.
Okay.
If you're ready. Yeah.
So, sounds good. I think one of the most important things we can do as a city is make sure that we're continuing to grow inclusively in terms of economics. I'm proud to say that my organization helped lead the fight to pass a $15 billion transportation package in Olympia. That's going to provide a decade worth of good living wage union jobs here in Washington State. We're also working hard to put transit on the ballot next year, which would be another $15 billion worth of capital construction. Those kinds of jobs are going to really be good family wage union jobs that I think are going to help continue to make the city and the region more affordable. As a city, we need to do a better job of prioritizing both our local hires as well as reaching out to immigrant and refugee communities to make sure that they feel like they're part of our system. I think one of the ways that we can do that is by working more closely with immigrant and refugee organizations to give them community outreach dollars, to be working within their community to organize. I think that's one of the best ways we move people up into government is by getting them access into government and how government works, and identifying those folks who are leaders within their community and making sure that they have resources to adequately do outreach. I am a big believer that community outreach isn't by putting up a sign on a signpost, but that it's by getting out into communities and resourcing those communities to be engaged. So I think those are some of the ways that I would work hard to make sure that the city was inclusive for everybody.
So I think that one of the areas that we can and should be focusing on is with our education dollars, specifically getting that outreach and getting folks connected with job opportunities and training opportunities. Senator Pramila Jayapal and I had a great conversation about something that we should be doing in Seattle, and that is putting in an education and economic development center here in Southeast Seattle specifically, which really is lacking. And we've got one in Southwest Seattle, one up in North Seattle, and it's to make that investment here so that folks who are in the community don't have to schlep somewhere else across the city, but instead can find those opportunities in their own neighborhoods. Now, what that means is, we have a lot of need in the city for workforce, for finishing trades, for the skilled trades to build out the light rail system, but we don't have that workforce actually ready. I would like to see us focusing a lot of our time working to connect people with opportunities within the skilled trades and the finishing trades so that folks can have a ladder out of poverty. As I like to say, $15 is great, $40 is a hell of a lot better, and that's the type of wages that you can make if you have that job training. I believe we must be more proactive in making those investments, as well as making that outreach with communities all across the city of Seattle, particularly in areas that have higher rates of poverty, so that we're providing people with the ability to make a living wage job with good benefits so they can continue to afford to reside and build community here in Seattle. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. I have spent my whole life, my professional, my personal life, working in communities that have been underserved. And Seattle is not an underserved community right now. We are in a boom. And so my specialty is I've had 3 decades of working and doing economic development and vitality in communities, whether it be the city of Seattle or the Tulalip tribe. And yes, the tribes had the benefits of having casinos that we fought for, but what we did with the money was what was important. How do we build a private sector? How do we bring business onto our communities? How do we make it so that they had to employ 95% of our people first? And so what I've seen in Seattle is that we're in the middle of this incredible boom, but people of color, low-income people, LGBTQ home buyers are becoming the casualties of this housing crisis. And so how can we be this schizophrenic of a city where we're doing really well economically, but we're in the middle of this big housing crisis, and we don't have the kind of job diversity, and we're not attracting that top-level talent? So what I've seen in building communities, one of the things I've got to do, I was a public defender, I was the legal services, I was a King County Superior Court judge, I got to work for 2 governors. I had the wonderful opportunity to work in an investment house where I did debt financing and built things. So I'm a builder. I learned how to take something from vision and brick and mortar, not just to build casinos or convention centers, but to build hospitals and police stations and affordable housing. But more importantly, I had to learn the economics of a community and see who wasn't being served and see who wasn't being hired. So there's 2 pieces here. One is we bring in the business that we have now. We demand that we look at wage parity, including for women. What are we looking at for minorities? And I'm not just about minority big contracts. I think that marginalizes us. I'm a big proponent of it, but I think it's just a Band-Aid. And I think the other piece is this, that we have to make it a priority that when big business comes in, that we look at who they're hiring, and we also look at our high schools and our colleges, that we're preparing them not only for college, but also for other jobs that aren't college, let's say, being a welder. So thank you. That's the only thing I can think of. Carpenter.
Another question from the audience. Undocumented immigrant youth and their families contribute nearly $300 million in local and state taxes, but are denied a voice at the ballot box with which to express how those tax dollars should be used. If elected, would you fight for the right to vote for all Seattle residents regardless of immigration status?
I'll go first, guys. I know you two are together down there. Absolutely. As I was sharing, I'm an enrolled member of the Blackfeet Nation. I'm a first-generation Latina. My father not only worked for Boeing, but my father, that was my stepfather. My father, Gabriel Juarez, served honorably in the U.S. Army and couldn't get a job in Tacoma and had to go pick apples in Eastern Washington. So yes, I would fight for that. I think that if you're here, there's no such thing as an illegal human being. I think that if you're in this country, we have a constitution. And the Constitution, though originally was made for a white male landowner, we've all learned in people of color that that's BS. We've gotten around that. Thank you. Civil rights and everything that came with it. So what I'm thinking is, and what I believe is that our people should have the right to vote, to have a driver's license, to have access to education and anything else, and particularly since we know a lot of our Hispanic and undocumented brothers and sisters have also served in 2 wars, and we're not recognized for that as they're veterans in their work to this country.
Say everything that Deborah said. I think
now you're sucking up to me.
I wholeheartedly agree that the fact of the matter remains that our community members are our community members, period. And everybody who's in our community, who are paying taxes, who are working in our neighborhoods, who are doing the things that we are all doing together to make this a better city, deserves to have a voice at the ballot box. And I'm going to take another step further on that. I believe we need to be more proactive as a city at identifying folks within our communities, regardless of citizenship status, to have places on our decision-making commissions and committees to make sure that voice is heard, not just at the ballot box, but also when we're making our decisions that are going to be impacting all of our communities. I'm very proud to be a Seattleite in a city where this is an actual real conversation. And next year, if I am successful, I look forward to working with willing council members to passion and push our city forward as a more inclusive city for all residents. Thank you.
You're going to hear a lot of unanimity, I think, amongst the 3 of us today. I also agree, and I think one of the biggest challenges about voting in the city right now is finding a stamp. I think we need to do a much better job of making sure that we're bringing ballot boxes to people, and so that we can feel like we all have an easy opportunity to have a vote. And I think that one of the things that I hear a lot from people who don't vote is that they're scared to make a mistake. And I think that opening up voting rights to everybody, regardless of citizenship status, allows everyone to feel like they're part of the process. That's got to be a critical issue for the city of Seattle moving forward, and I agree with everything that everybody else has said.
Ms. Sumet Mill, and the second question on here is going to gear towards education. As you know, many of our students do not fit in a traditionally structured classroom. So to prevent the school-to-prison pipeline, we must be creative in meeting the needs of these students. So how would you work with the Seattle Public Schools Board and CIRCC to ensure that all students have a fair chance to succeed by eliminating current disparities and ending the opportunity gap? And we can start with Rob first.
You haven't had a chance to, there's a little flyer in the back, you can see a picture. The twins are 4.5 and Hannah's 2. All 3 of those girls are going to be in public schools, and I'm very committed to the public school system. My aunt is the head secretary up at Ingram High School. We spend a lot of time talking about the ways that the city can be supporting kids in our public schools, and I'll give you a couple of good examples. Their principal up at Ingram, Principal Flo, has a really great relationship with the local librarian. So as a result, they do a lot of joint programming together for kids, particularly in working families, after school, but they're constantly struggling with the transportation system. How do you get those kids from the school to the library? How do we make sure that we have enough resources at the library to handle the kids that want to get trained and tutored at the library? So we as a city have a lot of responsibility at supporting kids in public schools, and that's something that I'm going to be pushing for as a city council member. Right now, we don't have anybody on city council with kids in public schools, and I feel like that's a very missing voice. One of the other ways we can be supporting our kids in schools is through our transportation. The school district spends $35 million a year busing kids to school. If we can make it easier for those kids to walk and bike to school, we're going to make it healthier for them, and we're going to be able to spend more of that money in the classroom. So the more we can do to support kids in public schools with the city's resources, the better. We have a $5 billion a year budget. We've got to do a better job of partnering with the school district to make sure that we're building priorities in our budget that complement what's going on at the school district, and I'm going to be a big champion for that. Thanks.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question to that, Rob. Can you speak specifically to the racial disproportionality? And you speak about transportation and having access for that, but how would you, if you were elected to be a council member, how would you speak to the racial disproportionality, and how would you address that specifically for communities of color?
So I would address it in two specific ways. One, in the North End, where Michael and I are seeking to represent, we've done a really great job of setting the system up so that people are successful. We have excellent public schools, we have excellent parks and open space, we have excellent public transportation. One of the recommendations in the housing affordability agenda is something called mandatory inclusionary zoning, which basically means that every new apartment building or any kind of building that gets built, we're going to mandate that a portion of that building is set aside for working families. That's going to open up a huge opportunity for us in the city to really give working families the opportunity to live in the North End, get access to public schools, get access to open space, get access to really great public transportation that they are being prevented from accessing right now. And watch out, because this is what activists are going to push against next. They are fighting in our neighborhood. I talked to an education activist who said to me, and I'm saying this seriously, I don't think I like mandatory inclusionary zoning because people are going to move here because they're going to want that Roosevelt address. And my response to that is, you're damn right they will, and you're damn right we want them to be able to get access to that Roosevelt address. So for me, mandatory inclusionary zoning is one of the most important pieces. But then the second piece is, how do we really look at the city's budget? And the city's budget has got to be prioritized through a race and social justice lens. In the North End, we have a lot of folks who want us to be building out more trees and tree canopy. We have excellent tree canopy in the North End. We got to be making sure that we're making investments in places like the 2nd and the 1st districts so that we're prioritizing green infrastructure, prioritizing public transportation, and prioritizing resources for our education system so we can reduce the wage gap, we can reduce educational differentiation between the districts, and really make it a better city for everybody.
That we need to be doing as a city is really providing that support for our teachers and our class and our programs that are doing great work. So right now, Karen Andrews, who runs the Interagency Academy, has been doing some fantastic things across the city, ensuring that all kids have that equitable access to education. I mean, this year, for instance, we actually saw our teachers. They were on strike, and it wasn't about pay. It was about reducing the reliance on testing. The testing mentality that we have in Yarny Duncan style of education is going to be very difficult, and it's going to put barriers in your way of having a quality education. So we need to be more proactive, I believe, as a city in standing up against that type of education policy, and instead allowing more alternatives to how we're going to be educating our children, working with our communities to make that happen. That means we're going to need more schools. We need to be a better partner with our school district on implementation of an impact fee schedule, an impact fee structure to build more schools. We have 26 school buildings that are needed to be built across the city of Seattle. We don't have the funding mechanism to do that. We need to make that happen. And from there, we need to open up our neighborhoods for all residents. You know, the one thing that we learned out of Yonkers was that if you allow individuals who are of modest incomes or even low incomes to be in areas that have higher incomes, they're getting access to better schools, because historically, we put all of our money into the white parts of the city. So let's make sure we're opening up all parts of the city to allow for all kids to have access to high quality public schools, high quality housing, and that better quality of life, so we continue to create that ladder out of poverty.
Thank you for joining us, Mike. So the question is geared towards education. I'll say it again. As you know, many of our students do not fit in traditionally structured classrooms. So to prevent the school-to-prison pipeline, we must be creative in meeting the needs of these students, and specifically students of color. How would you work with the Seattle Public Schools Board and CIRCC to ensure that all students have a fair chance to succeed by eliminating current disparities and ending the opportunity gap? So I'm going to start off with Deborah first, and then Mike, you'll be able to answer, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up what you said about the school-to-prison pipeline. That's been a concern of mine. And recently we were in front of the Seattle Education Association, and I learned that, found out that in Seattle, the average high school graduation rate for white kids is 72%. For African American kids, it's 52%, and for Native American kids, it's 32%. So you can't tell me that 48% of African American students and 68% of Native American students were kicked. So what my big problem was this, is when did a drug policy, zero tolerance, become an education policy? And we know the disparate impact it had on our communities. The war on drugs, the zero tolerance, the 3 strikes you're out, we know what that's done, and we're still feeling the residual effects of that. So your question is, what will we do about that? One thing that our community has done is 2 things. I believe in charter schools, and I know that we have 5 attorney generals that are asking the Washington State Supreme Court to revisit their decision. We know that not every school fits every need for every person of color and every child of color. In the Native American community, we just got passed that they will finally teach that Columbus did not discover America. Some of us were here. But look how long it took us to do that. I grew up in a school system where people were Redskins. I had to type over and over, watch the fat squaw weave a basket. In law school, I had to read cases in tort classes about the drunken Indians in a bar in Oregon. So I guess my point is I've kind of lived that and respond to that, and I don't want to put my litigator hat on or my former public defender hat on or my King County, but at some point you have to hold the school district responsible, you have to hold them liable, and you have to hold them accountable, that the curriculum has to fit the kids in the neighborhood in which they live. What goes on here in this community is different than what will go up on district number 5, which has 13 schools. Completely different systems, completely different communities, but there has to be some kind of core curriculum and respect for other cultures that have to be taught, and we also have to have the big stick of litigation when it doesn't. Thank you.
So I agree with a lot of what was said, and I apologize, folks, for being late. I'm bouncing between campaign events today, as I imagine a number of us are. The idea that we have to create inclusionary housing throughout the city, absolutely right. I heard both Rob and Michael say that, and I fully agree, and I'm working hard to make sure that we're doing inclusionary zoning. We are revising our comprehensive plan, and we've done a map of the city and looked at which are the communities we call communities of opportunity. Those are the communities where people just statistically do better. There's less crime, there's better schools, there's better parks. And then there's also communities where there's high risk of displacement. And we need to figure out, and those are the communities often where there's lots of renters, and as rents go up, they get moved out, and they can't maintain stability in those communities. We need to figure out with our development patterns how we can get more people living in those communities of opportunity. And a lot of those are in my district, in District 6. We need to be an open and welcome community because we have the infrastructure already. We have good transit, we have great schools, great parks. As kids raised in that community statistically is going to have a better chance of succeeding than in some other areas in the neighborhood, and we should make that community open to everyone. Now, specifically around the school-to-prison pipeline, I'm proud that the City Council unanimously adopted a resolution just last month stating the city's for zero youth detention in Seattle. The idea that we lock up a single one of our kids is appalling. And while I'm proud of the resolution, it's just a piece of paper, and we have a lot of work to do to implement the types of programs to make sure kids aren't in that criminal justice system. We need zero out-of-school expulsion or suspension policies for the schools. We need to have the support programs for families. Kids make mistakes. My kids make mistakes, but when my kids make mistakes, people intervene and they get put on the right track. Some kids are targeted and singled out, and when they make a mistake, they end up in the criminal justice system and it affects them forever.
you for your responses. The next question is regarding housing. Many members of our communities are having a difficult time finding housing that they can afford. What is your definition of affordable housing, and what will you do to ensure that immigrants, refugees, and people of color have access to such housing? And we'll start with Deborah.
God, please, Lord. I'm so becoming a better Catholic now. So, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I was like, all of a sudden, holla flashed in my head, and I had like a attack.
Sure. So regarding housing, many members of our communities are having a difficult time finding housing. What is your definition of affordable housing, and what will you do to ensure that immigrants, refugees, and people of color have access to such housing?
Okay, that's good. I'm glad. Now I understand. I'm sorry. My definition of affordable housing, and when we talk about livability, mean one thing. It means access. And access means access to the good stuff. Access to transit, to grocery stores, community centers, good schools, and all the amenities that come with what Mike was saying, what's in a good neighborhood. And not everyone has the benefit of a nice zip code. What I've been pushing is the diversity, not just in housing, but in mixed income neighborhoods, revisiting and talking about what kind of upzones would look like in particular neighborhoods that are ready for particular upzones. Ensuring that if we do transit housing, transit-oriented housing, or workforce housing, that we don't displace those communities that are there, that we're not just building townhouses and condos for a rich single person that works at Amazon so they can just walk across the street and hop on light rail station. Displacement is how I look at that. That's what I'm really focused on. My whole life growing up, we were renters. I didn't know what a mortgage was until I went to law school. I learned through HALA that the 5 neighborhoods I've lived in for 25 years in the North End, my family could not have lived there in 1960 because there are racial covenants. Now, if I can get over that fact, that in 1960 as a Mexicana Native American woman that I could live in the 5 neighborhoods that I've lived in for 25 years in North Seattle, if I can get over that racial issue, I think the rest of Seattle can as well. I think we have to look at HALA as a blueprint. I think we have to, as we do in life about anything, we look at our past and we learn from it and we move forward. So I, for one, am proud of the mayor's plan. There's 65 recommendations. They're all going to be put to the test, and I'm hoping all of our communities of color and our supporters come forward and support that so we secure affordable housing and livability for everybody in this great city. Thank you.
So, access to affordable housing is obviously critically important. It's always been, but certainly today when we see the dramatic increases of housing costs in our city and throughout the region. The HALA plan has targets for a whole range of affordability, and I think it's important that we're building at all of those levels of affordability. So at the deepest level of affordability, the threshold we have is 30% of area mean income. And so that would be an individual making less than probably about $15,000 or $20,000 a year. This is the most affordable housing for folks that are often formerly homeless, or folks that are maybe recent immigrants or refugees who are not prepared to actually have really any income at all. The next step up is 50 or 60% of AMI. Or I should say the housing levy that currently exists and hopefully will be renewed next year at a higher level is one of the major tools for producing that affordable housing at 30% of AMI. The next level up, 50 or 60% of AMI, the proposal is that private development through this mandatory inclusionary housing, this is that for the first time in Seattle's history, every new development in a commercial zone or multifamily zone will be required to provide affordable housing on site or contribute to affordable housing being built nearby. And the target for those is at 60% of area mean income. So a single person making about $30,000, a family of 4 closer to $60,000. We also have a program called the Multifamily Tax Exemption, which is a voluntary program for private developers to set aside 20-25% of their units at 80% of mean income, which is a slightly higher level. We need all of those levels of affordability. So that folks, as they move through our society, as they get better jobs, they have places to transition. But it's critical that we have a robust network of housing throughout the spectrum.
Thank you. Rob?
So I'm an urban planner by training, so I spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. And the way that I define affordable housing is not just sort of the traditional method of 30% of your monthly income is what you should be paying roughly for housing, but also your transportation costs is part of that too. Because in this region we have not just an affordability crisis, but we have a lot of people who are quote unquote driving to qualify. So if you're living in the South End and your apartment is becoming more and more expensive, you're moving further and further south, which means that you're driving longer and longer distances. So it's not just your housing costs, but also your transportation costs that are getting to be a larger portion of our household incomes. We need to do everything we can to help lower both of those. So the strategies that I would implement on the housing side would be upzoning in a lot of our neighborhoods where we've got really great and frequent transits around the light rail stations as well as along our frequent bus lines. I would be a proponent of building more affordable housing in the way that Mike defined it for the 0 to 60%. They're doubling our housing levy next year. I'm a big proponent of neighborhood-based planning, which means I've seen a lot of communities that have had developers come in and say, this is the kind of thing that we think your community wants. I want our communities to determine the kind of amenities that they want. If one community wants a neighborhood school and another community wants a neighborhood community center, we as a city should be responsive to those community needs and working with those communities to make sure that we're getting the infrastructure that they want in their community to reduce gentrification. The last thing that I would say is I think that it needs to be a holistic approach. So we need to look at things like expanding eligibility for the low-income fare for transit service. Right now, that's $24,000 a year in the city of Seattle. If you're making $34,000 a year in the city of Seattle, you should be eligible for reduced transit pass. And we should also be looking at issues like food deserts and parks and open space to make sure that we're not building housing far away from where you can get access to good open space and good, healthy food options.
Long list here. I think on the first part of that question, what do I define as affordable housing? It's housing you can afford while still being able to have access to things like schools and grocery and transportation. I'm the only renter on the ballot this fall. My daughter and I, we live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the East Lake neighborhood, and I'm paying 40% of my income into rent because we can't afford to move, is where we have become in this city. In the event we were able to find a 2-bedroom housing unit anywhere, the move-in costs alone would prevent us from being able to actually get there. So we just have to take that increase year over year, tighten our belt again and again, and that's a situation that so many families I talk to are finding themselves in. So what does that mean? I think it means we need more housing types, and especially more family-sized housing throughout the city of Seattle. When we're doing things like the Yesler Terrace redevelopment, we need to ensure that we are having, in the future, we're going to need to meet those low income, the 30% and below AMI housing units built first near site and build out to the maximum capacity so we can have as many units of low income housing there as possible. We need to make sure that we're having that human infrastructure that's also built in. Schools, parks, community centers, access to things such as grocery stores, because we have so many food deserts throughout the city of Seattle. We need to change that dynamic. Make sure we're bringing in more farmers markets wherever possible so people can have access to healthy food options. Childcare is a huge thing, and right now in the city of Seattle, more often than not, you can only get childcare from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. What if you work a swing shift? Then you're SOL. And we got to find more ways that we can support childcare providers, providing more options for childcare throughout the city of Seattle. As Rob said, we need to work with our communities on what that growth is going to look like, the physical aspect of it. But at the end of the day, we do need more housing that's connected to our transportation infrastructure. We need more housing that's connected to good quality schools so our kids aren't on a bus for a half an hour to get to school. And so I think we've got a lot of great things coming down with the Hall of recommendations. And I would also add on top of that, we need to dip into our bonding capacity to build thousands of units of additional housing because it's something that we have a need for in our city. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question for all 4 candidates. How would you be able to reach immigrants and refugee families who suffer from trauma, have limited English, are very hyper-marginalized within their communities, the people who are very vulnerable, the ones that don't have the voice on paper as well as in person? How how would you, if elected, be able to address this in order to help support them and their housing needs? And let's start off with Mike.
Well, I'll start by talking about my view of how district elections are going to play differently. So for the past 6 years, I've been a city council member here in Seattle, and I've been elected citywide, so I represent everyone in the city, even though I live in Fremont. With the switch to district elections, there's a lot of focus on and a lot of questions about what does that mean to be a district representative. And certainly I will spend more time in District 6, Northwest Seattle, Ballard, Fremont, Finney. But I think it's critically important that all council members, regardless of where they're elected to serve, that they're staying in contact with people throughout the city of Seattle. Because we are still 9 people that are passing policies that affect the entire city. And while my district, District 6, is probably the least racially diverse district in the city, I would like to see that change. I would like to see District 6 be more racial. I value the diversity we have throughout Seattle and want to make sure as a council member, I think the city is better off by us supporting communities throughout Seattle. Specifically to folks that are struggling with integrating into our system, how can we do that? Well, one thing we can do is at the city that make sure that we have specific programs that address those concerns. I can highlight a program that we have through the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, working with the police department, partnering recent immigrants with a police officer to really learn about how the criminal justice system works and often doesn't work, but also to build relationships between the police department and people from communities. So we can continue to do programs like that, but we also need to support the advocacy organizations in our community that are already here working with those immigrant communities. Oftentimes folks come from countries where government is not something you go to for help. Even people that grew up in this country sometimes don't go to government for help. And we need to acknowledge that and make sure there's capacity and support for the organizations in our communities, like this organization, One America, that are working with immigrants and can provide those programs.
That's a really good question, and I've been blessed enough in my career that working for United Indians, being the attorney for United Indians, Seattle Indian Health Board, Seattle Indian Center, other ethnic and tribal organizations. I like what Mike said, because when we're going to a district system, it's true, we will honor and advocate for our district, but we serve the greater good of Seattle. I am more than familiar with what goes on. I've been in Seattle 30 years, 25 years in my neighborhood, but the 5 years I started out in Capitol Hill and Fremont, Sandpoint, and found my way north. But let me give you a good example. Now we know that the mayor just passed, or now we've seen in the budget, in the Office of Labor Standards. What I like about what I read about that is I would use the existing advocacy organizations as an example when you look at that. The mayor has just set aside $1 million for over 12 advocacy organizations to implement Standards mission, and that is to investigate and educate, to enforce the wage theft, enforce the job assistance ordinance, the $15 minimum wage, all of those kind of issues. So as a former social worker, caseworker, public defender, I kind of already know what organizations are out there and who I would go to access, whether it's housing, whether it's education, and of course now with the Office of Civil Rights and now having the Office of Labor Standards within the Office of Civil Rights. I think that's real important, and I think those of us that have lived in the city kind of know where we need to go. It will be nice to sit on a city council and work with any of these gentlemen and be able to talk to them about what's going on in their district. How can I, Deborah in North Seattle, know exactly what's going on in West Seattle? I was a big proponent of the district system for that very reason. It was a natural extension of me growing up on the reservation where we represented our people from our district. You should live with the people that represent you. Thank you.
So the nonprofit that I run, Transportation Choices, gets a small amount of funding from the city. And the amount of funding that we get from the city means that we have an open door relationship. Oftentimes, folks from the city's Department of Transportation come to us and ask us questions. Oftentimes, we go to them with ideas or thoughts or questions. It's that kind of model that I think we should be replicating in other communities throughout the city. And I think that Councilmember O'Brien talked a little bit about this in terms of how do we prioritize city resources within the budget to make sure that we're supporting trusted neighbors within our communities. I think that's one of the ways that we can prioritize those that don't have a voice, is by resourcing up the organizations that work with those individuals, so that when issues like the closing of hookah lounges comes up, we can do a good job of responding and prioritizing within the city's resources to make sure that issues like that don't come up in the future. I'm a big believer that we should have had a pathway for hookah lounges to be able to become legal, and a better job of doing outreach into communities that were impacted by that decision. We wouldn't have come to the conclusion that we came to as a city. So prioritizing city resources has got to be part of it. Prioritizing funding for the Office of Immigrant and Refugees has got to be a priority. But then also it's got to be incumbent upon us as council members to make sure that we're hiring people of color into positions of power within the organization. So that not only means within our offices individually, but also within the city as a whole. I'm proud to say that my organization is a majority women of color. My campaign staff is a majority people of color. So this isn't just a value of mine, but I think it's something that we need to be putting into practice once we get elected as well. Thank you.
Some of the best things that we can do as elected officials is be out and be engaging with communities, regardless of whether or not they are in our own district. You know, we are in Northeast Seattle, we're a different district, but a lot of the issues that we've been talking about today, I see these are issues that are affecting and it just happened. Just had my word salad. Our issues that are primarily affecting areas south of I-90 especially, and I'm very proud to have, throughout this campaign, regularly gone throughout the city of Seattle to have a better understanding of what's going on in various neighborhoods. This is the same thing that we did on the Parks Legacy Committee when we went out to all sorts of communities to ensure that we were going to make the investments in our park system and our community centers for culturally competent program within all the community centers by partnering better with various organizations and leaders in our communities. And that's something that I would want to continue to do as a council member, because even though for me, what I look at is we're going to have a lot of opportunities to be more equitable our investments across the city of Seattle. And so that means for me, what I have to do as a district council member is be an ambassador back to the people of District 4. And when they're saying, how come we're not getting all sorts of money for our park space over at Magnuson, and a lot of it's going down to Southeast Seattle or to Lake City, it's because we have neglected those areas for so long as a city that it is time for us to make that higher investment in those parts of our city. So that's one area that I would think we need to do, is ensure that we're allowing more third-party reporting. You know, a lot of folks that I talk to who are immigrants, who are refugees, have said that they don't feel comfortable going to the government directly because of their experience and where they come from originally, but they do feel comfortable going to the nonprofit organizations working within their communities, making sure that those organizations are very well connected with city departments to make those third-party complaints, so we can be strong in our investigation with the Office of Labor Standards, with code enforcement for our apartment buildings. We all know with the Hagman property in Southeast Seattle. And then from there, you know, as Rob said, we need to make sure we're putting, I said earlier, more people from immigrant communities and communities of color on our boards and commissions, and making those decisions.
Thank you for answering those questions. I just want to put some context to that. I want to make sure we differentiate rhetoric from action. And one of the things that I've learned recently in the last week is that the Seattle Police with Seattle University for a public safety survey, and they have it in basically 7 languages that are in Tier 1 and Tier 2 priority, which is Amharic, Chinese, English, Korean, Somali, Spanish, and Vietnamese. I think that's 6 or 7. But they're leaving out a whole bunch of other populations that live in Seattle. They don't even have Tagalog or Ilocano or Khmer or Laotian into it. And that's specifically why I asked that question. So I just want us to keep in mind about rhetoric and action, and how do we hold systems accountable for that. So from now on, I'm going to pass the mic to Yoshi, and he's going to ask the last question.
All right, thank you guys for showing up today. My name is Yoshi. The last question is on public safety. Our communities are disproportionately represented in our prison system. What do you think the reason is for this, and how will you work with CIRCC to address this disproportionality? My apologies. And we'll start with Rob in District 4 and go from there.
So I think So I think that public safety is a critically important issue in the city right now, and we're feeling it more in this end. When I go to neighborhood meetings in the North End, the most common complaint that I get from people is about developers building new buildings without enough parking spaces. When I come to meetings in the South End, it is a very different conversation, and it's much more connected to issues of economic disparity and public safety. So I think we need to recognize that we're building a city that is effectively two different cities right now. So one of the ways that I would work to address that is to make sure that we have access to economic opportunity in ways that we don't have right now, which is how do we build more in the city to ensure that we have hiring practices. The local hiring practice that we've got in the city is a good start, but I think we need to reduce the eligibility requirements so that our capital projects at the $1 million or the $2 million level are subject to the same local hire requirement that the $5 million level is. I think one of the most important things we can do is more neighborhood policing. So how do we make sure that officers are not in patrol cars, but actually out in the community engaging with people on a day-to-day basis? I don't believe that the answer to public safety is just hiring more officers. I don't think that that's the solution. I think the answer is actually making sure that our officers are on the ground interacting with people so that they understand the needs of the community. But I also think that generally this is about economic justice as much as anything else. How do we provide better educational opportunities for people to reduce that educational disparity that we have in our education system? How do we resource more communities to make sure that they feel like they've got access to economic opportunity? And how do we continue to make the city more affordable by building more affordable housing? Those are some of the issues that I would focus on as a city council member, but this is a really critical issue, and I regret that we only have 2 minutes to talk about it, because we should be talking about this more as a city.
I think for one, we need to make sure that our criminal justice system is in a way that's focused on making sure that we're rehabilitating people and putting them back in communities as community members and less on punishment. So what does that look like? I mean, I think for one, it's how we're doing our charging, what we're doing with respect to identifying individuals who are engaged in so-called criminal behavior. One thing I think we have done successfully in Pioneer Square, as well as in Belltown, we need to expand it throughout the city, is the law enforcement assisted diversion program. People don't engage in criminal behavior because it's a fun thing to do. More often than not, it's a result of extreme poverty. But from there, one thing I think we must be making sure we are investing more dollars in our human infrastructure, in our social programs, in housing to really combat poverty, because that's something that we're seeing a rise of in our city. We have 3,000 living outdoors, not in shelter. 42 people so far this year have died because of violence against persons who are experiencing homelessness. Our community members are freezing literally outdoors. We need to make that investment, and that investment is a priority. Specifically with respect to our police department, we need to make sure our police department looks more like our communities. That means not waiting for people in our communities to come and apply, but be more proactive and find out what do we need to do to attract more folks who are living in our neighborhoods to want to be part of protecting of our neighborhoods. Because it's not enough to just have safe neighborhoods from each other. We also need to be safe from our law enforcement personnel. Finally, we need more of that community policing. When I worked for Planned Parenthood, I was at an outreach facility working with high-risk and homeless youth. And some of the kids experienced some just real troublesome interactions with the police department in Everett. And we were able to work closely with the police department, with our sergeant in the area to get some new folks assigned. And they would actually come in and hang out and not be there instead to interact with our kids. When we get that interaction and we have that better community policing aspect, we're going to have better connections and and people are going to be feeling safer with our law enforcement. And that's something I think we need to invest in, and something I will focus on as a council member. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've answered that question a lot on the campaign trail, and I'm really proud to be up here with these three gentlemen because they've always been very articulate and sensitive. So let me just say this. I think that we need to enforce the consent decree. I think it's a shame that Department of Justice found that we had excessive force and discriminatory policing, at least made a legal finding of excessive force and discriminatory policing, because what that equaled was this: more men of color in jail. Now, going back to 1986, when I was a public defender, and then when I was a judge, we were talking about these same issues back then. And without making any kind of disparities on any group, it wasn't until WTO and other people's kids start getting arrested it became an issue. And as public defenders, and I was a founding commission with Justice Smith and other judges of color, because on the ground as public defenders, we were seeing discriminatory policing, excessive force, calling out the K-9 unit only in the CD. So now this is what we have. Fast forward 20 years, Justice is now saying what we've always been saying for 25 years. So we need to make the CPC, the Community Police Commission, permanent. We need to have the training for the officers. And when we talk about community policing, I'm talking about the police officer that we have should live in the city. If judges have to live in the city in which they have to judge people, I think police who have to police the community should live in those communities, period. The second part of that is, it makes me sad that this city has finally come to the realization that we are a big city with big city problems. We can all cheer about winning the Super Bowl, that we're #1 in gender pay disparity, we're #4 in homelessness, and I can go on and on about the statistics. And that's the dirty little secret, because we're not addressing those issues that disparately affect communities of color. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stand up for this one. It's our last one. So you asked the question, why are there disproportionate number of people of color in jail? And my answer on this one is pretty simple. Racism. The institutions in our city are comprised of components of racism, despite really good progressive people that have been running the city for so long. You know, there's no other explanation why, if you're 8 times as likely to be in our youth criminal justice system than if you're white. And it's not just the criminal justice system. You know, you've heard everyone cite data, you know, graduation rates at schools, health outcomes. If you live in South Park in Georgetown, your life expectancy is 10 years less than elsewhere in the city. And so all the solutions that we've talked about today are things that we should be doing and are good. But we need to understand that racism is part of these institutions, and we have to identify that as a problem and actively be working to undo racism in these institutions. I'm going to give you a couple examples where we see it. You know, crime happened outside a couple hookah lounges, and the response at the city was, let's shut down all hookah lounges. Those are bars owned, or lounges owned by people of color and frequented by people of color. If they happened out of a dance club that I frequented, we wouldn't talk about closing down all bars in Seattle. We don't do that when crime happens. The taxi industry. If someone came along and tried to pirate software from Microsoft or Amazon, we would act swiftly to behavior because that is illegal. But when someone like Uber or Lyft comes to town and sets up a business model that is illegal, but is preying on people largely of color who are making a living off of it, we sit on our hands and say we can't figure out how to address this. We have to undo racism throughout our city.
Thank you, candidates, for answering those questions. I have one particular extra question to follow up on that trail of racism and how do we look at that. Specifically, I want to know, how would you propose in holding businesses accountable for their complicity towards racism? And the reason why I'm asking this is because there are instances where friends of mine have been in altercations and businesses were basically complicit with that racism. Last night, we went to protest the VidCon ban over at Numos, and that's another instance where Numos would not shut down VidCon. They were complicit and insensitive culturally, racially, and ethnically to the people's history. So what is your proposed action to hold businesses accountable for their complicity towards racism? And we're going to start off first with Michael.
That is an excellent question. I think we have anti-discrimination policies in the city of Seattle, but you can have all the policies you want, but they don't mean bupkis if you don't actually enforce them, and they don't have any teeth to them. So I think the first thing that we must be doing is experiencing that type of just blatant racism within the private sector, that they have the ability to make that report to our Office of Civil Rights, that our Office of Civil Rights actually will get up, has the teeth, has the funding necessary to go and investigate and punish companies that are engaged in that type of behavior. We see this. We see it with racism. We see it with discrimination against transgender persons. We see it across the board in our city, which is very unfortunate because we're supposed to be this big liberal city, yet we're experiencing so much of these problems, and we need to be willing to address them. We need to identify that they exist and be willing to talk about them. You know, the fact that that band was allowed to play at Numos, and I don't think I heard a single person in leadership in our city stand up to say that this was wrong. I mean, we'll gladly do it if it's on TV. You know, if you're on the cooking channel and you make some racist statements, we're going to boycott you. You know, if you're making homophobic comments on out of something involving ducks, we'll gladly boycott you. But here in Seattle, if you come in with a clearly racist name for a band, that's okay. That's private enterprise. We need, I believe, to be more proactive, be willing to stand up and say that it's wrong, and where we can ensure that civil rights has the authority and the tools necessary to be punitive when those actions are specifically against members of our community, especially members who have ties in the city of Seattle.
You know, I think that prioritization in the city's budget is one of the best ways that we can really articulate policy. You know, we can pass, as Councilmember O'Brien mentioned, we can pass a lot of resolutions. Those are words on paper unless they're supported by actual resources within the city's budget to help follow up on those important policy statements. So two things that I would make sure that I do is we need to put more funding into the Office of Labor Standards to make sure that we're doing a good job of not only responding to people who feel like they've been victims of workplace discrimination, but also proactively doing investigations, are rooting out racism within businesses in our communities. And then the second thing is, again, putting more funding into the Office of Civil Rights to be able to spend more of our time and energy making sure that we're making examples of businesses that are not consistent with our values as a community. Part of the solution, I think, is also city council members giving a megaphone and a voice to folks who feel like they're not getting a voice at City Hall. So that means standing up with community members. That means being at rallies. That means making sure that when we show up, we invite TV cameras to come along with us, so that we are making sure that these issues are on the front page of the paper and on the nightly news, not swept under the rug. And then the last thing that I would say is I think it's critically important that each of our offices, each of the 7 districtly elected council members, prioritize within their own personal budgets a district office, so that people who feel like they're being disenfranchised, feel like they're victims of discrimination, they can have a safe place to come. They don't have to come to the sort of scariness that is City Hall between 9 and 5 on a weekday, but they can come to elected officials and our staffs in their neighborhood to feel like they've got a recourse, and that's a thing that I would prioritize as a council member.
I want to go back to your question because that's a really good one. And you're specifically zoning in on businesses. Businesses that we should hold accountable when there is racism involved. So we're not talking about government, correct? So businesses. And again, I'm the only lawyer up here, I think. Right, Michael? You're, okay. No, nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying. I've been a lawyer for 28 years, but despite that, I have made a living out of suing businesses, the federal government, city and state, half of tribes and tribal organizations, but also in other organizations of people of color that have been treated, that their constitutional rights have been violated based on their race. And so when you hold businesses accountable, I don't want to sound like I was at Legal Services and we went after businesses. We filed lawsuits in the EEOC after businesses. But I don't want to sound like the litigious woman up here, but there's something to be said about suing people. And I've been good at that. I've made a lot of money from doing that. And I'm proud of that because I did it for the right reasons. Even though I've been a lawyer for 28 years, over half of my practice was in the public sector, being at legal services, being a public defender, serving 2 governors. And when I went to private practice and chaired the tribal practice group and did not just business, a lot of pro bono, we represented a lot of individuals who were fighting against Boeing, Microsoft, groups of people and individuals. It also helped certify class action lawsuits, like you're seeing now with the Uber people. They just got certified in a class action lawsuit. So at some point, there's the civil disobedience, civil rights lawyer, community activist in me, but it's kind of like once you cross that line, then it gets ugly. Then I'm just ready to sue you. That's kind of where I'm at.
So one thing I think to do when we're trying to combat racism, wherever it is, but including in businesses, is I think that work needs to, at the center of that work needs to be the people that are directly impacted by it. And so as a white male, straight, I am the privileged class. I live in a system that was designed to make me successful. I don't experience and I don't often see those acts of racism in my life. And so the way to solve that, one is let's make sure we have diverse leadership. And I'm excited to say that it looks like there's a possibility we'll have 4 people of color on the city council, which would be outstanding. And the work, we need to find ways for folks and encourage folks who are experiencing that work, who are directly impacted by racism, to be at the center of solving solutions. And so, and as someone who benefits from these systems, I commit to be an ally to that work and support that work as best I can. There are other things that we can be doing. We can be doing, for the rental market, we actually send out, what do we call it? We basically do testing where we send out people, white people and people of color, to apply for rental housing. And what we find, embarrassingly, is over 60% of the time we do that, we find acts of racism in how folks are offering housing to people. I don't know how we would do that at businesses. I guess we could send us into a bar and get in a fight and see who they pick. But there are probably things we can do. And then there's also just accountability. When we hear stories, we can shame folks. We can say that this is inappropriate. There's a component of education too. We need to be having conversations about race throughout our society, because there are people that don't believe they're doing that, and yet the evidence is that they are. And how do we bring them along and have them understand?
Thank you all for your eloquent responses. This is our last question. Are you committed to meeting with CIRCC leadership within 60 days of the election to review CIRCC's advocacy goals and objectives? Yes or no? We can just go down.
Yes.
Yes, and I appreciate the proactiveness of that nature. I think too many advocacy organizations are reactive, and so I'm very grateful for CIRCC for being a proactive organization that wants to accomplish good things in the city.
Absolutely, and I want to thank you for inviting us. It really meant a lot to me to look out and see a lot of people that look like me. Thank you.
Yes.